back to order. Welcome back to those of you that are online. I hope you had a delicious lunch. We had a very delicious lunch here of rolls and salad. Very nice. And I would like to open the debate on the item 9 notice of motion. And the process, as I gave the heads up before lunch, was the seconder, Councillor Paul Young, will kick us off. Then we'll just go through the speaking order, so get your names in. I'm sure I'll have plenty of names on this order. And then Councillor Stewart will wrap up at the end. And then we will put the motion, and just a heads up as well as that, so you don't have to say it, I propose that we do a division on this one, because someone will say it, I think. Okay, are we ready to go? Let's do it. Okay, Councillor Young, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Thank our Howick local and the Sunny Hill residents for their passionate deputation. Staff consider the land as a suppers. However, I support the opportunity for our colleagues around this table and online to consider the desire of my community to changing the council's decision to sell. I think it's a small loss in the annual budget compared to a great win for us, responding to overwhelming community support to retain this piece of the public land. Particularly, there's no proper amenity assessment of this reserve compared with other nearby reserves. From the information, from the local feedback, the amenity value per square meter is higher in this reserve than other green space nearby. I agree protecting reserves land is critical for future generations, and we don't take the sales of the public space lightly. What we are debating here is, again, a very difficult choice. As a ward councillor, I'm very much torn between my role as a champion for Howick and my regional role looks across the city and what might be best for the people of Auckland. We have heard from our staff, recycling is an important lever for the council, allowing capital to be reinvested in our park network. If the sales of the 40-foot go ahead, it will be a disappointment to our local community. However, I'm glad to see a few reserves have been kept, such as in Golfland, and there are a few recent purchases of opening space for our community in Howick Ward. Thank you to all my fellow committee members for your consideration. Thank you, Kira.
Thank you, Councillor. Moving right along to online, we have the Councillor for the Foe, Tracy Mulholland.
Thank you, Chair. Just, sorry. Can you hear me clearly? Sorry, I'm just wondering whether you can hear me clearly.
Thanks. Yep.
Lovely, thanks, Chair. So 40-foot lane, I think it's an excellent, well-constructed notice of motion from Councillor Stewart, and I'm happy to support it. And looking through the history of this item, I believe that perhaps a wrong decision was made, and unfortunately not on just this one occasion, but in relation to this. I think the great thing is we have the opportunity to say there was a mistake made in the past, so let's correct it. I want to also acknowledge all of the supporters in the public forum. Now, with regards to this, the general purpose, I understand, of the Reserves Act, and directly quoting from Section 3, general purpose of the Act is to provide for the preservation management for the benefit and enjoyment of the public areas of New Zealand possessing one recreational use or potential, whether active or passive. And I believe that we have heard today from the public, and whilst, yes, we have individual wards, but we have to think across the whole of Tamaki, but the public in the area have made it abundantly clear that they are using the park for their enjoyment, and it is fit for purpose in that regard. It's also nice to note, just on the comment from the public, Chair, and councillors, that they were willing to put their hands up to contribute to this when they already pay rates. So reserves, I think, are for a community enjoyment and not cash reserves for councils. So, and looking at those decisions, I agree that we shouldn't be selling off the land. Just with regards to any doubt about revoking the reserve status, I don't think we should take into consideration that in this case as an opportunity to put a small amount of cash into the coffers. With regards to the financials, and thank you to the team that have provided all of the information, I understood, and I may be corrected because I'm not a valuer, but it's around between $1.72 million in land, but that's only a guess, as I say, and perhaps that is a small amount on our council budget, although I'm always one to say that every cent counts. So with regards to selling, will that have a great impact on the budget, not this particular amount? And considering other aspects of work that we do, I think that is a small sum for the value. And when you look at the history of the land and what the purpose was to put the little pocket park in there, and the demands made, well, the requirement made of a developer, I think it all makes sense in what the public in the area was saying. So whilst we do take a regional perspective and we have to approve the sale of some assets, of which I supported in part with regards to some spaces that were actually surplus to requirements or not required or required more funding than we had, I think that makes sense in terms of a sale, but in this case I don't. And I think that it is good that elected members get to question each other based on a past decision and moving forward, because that's what our duty is to do, serve the public and put forward questions so that we do have a better tamaki in the future. So I ask councillors to also support me with regard to this notice of motion. I thank the Howard Ward councillor. I thank the board and everyone that has taken the time to just sit and listen to each other with regards to this decision. So I'll be supporting the decision, and I ask councillors, please, in this case, to be consistent with regards to the view of the sum that I've heard from and support the motion. Kia ora, Chair. Thank you for the opportunity to speak, and thank you to the Councillor Sharon Stewart for bringing this forward and for bringing it to our attention.
Cool. Thank you, Councillor. Moving right along to Councillor Sayers.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Look, I'll just make a very brief comment. I will be supporting the notice of motion, Chair. It's illogical to sell any park off cheaply now when a replacement one will cost many more times that price in future years. The parks are vital to retain due to Auckland's growing population and Auckland's growing population needing access to recreational space, and that's the primary reason why I'll be supporting the motion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Councillor. So far we've only got two more speakers. I'm sure there'll be more people putting their hands up. We'll go to Councillor Watson.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. And I think it was Oscar Wilde who once said that a fool is someone who knows the price of everything and the value of nothing. And I think this is exemplified in this instance here, particularly as it goes to the value of open space. We heard from some of the members of the public in their submission of the importance of open space, and any of the academic work reinforces that. Green Space Scotland referred to a number of US studies which found that residents who lived in public housing with exposure to nature, open space and trees had far greater mental well-being outcomes and ability to cope with stress, etc. We know that because we've been told it, and it's quite straightforward really, because the impact of green space on mental health includes things just like outdoor activity, exercise, natural daylight, stimulation of the senses and so forth and so on. But it is the proximity of that open space that is important, not a football field across the Pakuranga Highway or an open space up in the boulevard that was quoted here that is surrounded by road, no footpaths, and totally unsuitable for playing sport of any kind on a totally different level of amenity. That seems to have gone unnoticed here. And I would just remember the members here today and online that in terms of the principles that guide the disposal of assets such as this, the first principle that's mentioned, and I brought it up with the Howick chair, in terms of effective governance and decision making, was to consider the views and preferences of the local board. And they have been the model of consistency on that in opposing this sale, and in particular 40-foot lane. And why would they? Well, they would do that because in the first instance they're reflecting the overwhelming view of their community. I mean, the submission process there was phenomenal. I would suggest the biggest response from the Howick ward since this council has been formed. That's one reason. They're reflecting the very clearly articulated views of their community. The other reason, and I only came to realise it myself when I went out to 40-foot lane and had a look, is that this is a wonderful piece of open space for the type of informal activity that we saw taking place there. People walking their dogs, kids climbing trees, a throwback to the good old days of the 60s where you could have a community game of cricket or kids could go and kick a ball around. There's room to do that. A number of the spaces that we provide through our current acquisition policies don't actually provide that now. They may have good amenity in terms of kids' playgrounds and whatnot, but they don't have that kind of open space use that's provided for in 40-foot lane. So that's why the local board are going into bat and their councillors, because this is an ideal piece of open space that is valued by the local community. The other reason, if they keep abreast of any developments that are occurring, is the national policy stuff that's going on, where we have this phenomenal tsunami of intensification coming. All that area now is mixed housing urban, which is a quantum leap in the ability for infill housing, for resource consented developments of more than one property can go up to 7 or 8 with a resource consent. So we could have an absolute exponential growth of the number of people living here, and in particular the number of, excuse me, of the young people. So when you start putting those things together, we have a very compelling case for the value of this particular piece of open space. No, not a piece of open space up in Millwater, not a piece of open space on the boulevard, which is not a sense of any value in terms of this one. So we should be taking it on this individual case. And I fear we're going into the old penny wise, pound foolish mentality where some target of asset sales, which one would have thought in the last few years with the rise in land values and property prices would have seen us a little bit ahead of the 8 ball in terms of the funds that have come in through specifically through the asset sales. So we have a situation, Mr. Chair, at its most basic, where the local community, their local board representatives, their councillors have said that this is an important priority for them. It is an existing open space. They should not have to be going to buy, after this ward pays about $170 million in rates per annum, I don't think they should have to be turning around to buy a piece of reserve space back. That is a little perverse, I would say. So we've got an opportunity as the governors around here is to actually fulfil that very first principle, to take on board the views of the local board who represent their local community and maintain, preserve this very much valued piece of open space that all requires us to do is to cut the grass once in a while. That's our capital expenditure on it. And we're doing that at the same time as that the level of development in this area is going to go through the roof. It's already happening under the unitary plan mixed housing suburban. What's it going to be like when the mixed housing urban comes in? So, ladies and gentlemen, I would just simply say in conclusion that the relevant information has been put forward before us today to make the right choice here, and that is to preserve the small pocket of reserve that is so important and so valued by the people we represent as well, not just Councillor Stewart and Young, but us as well as regional councillors. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Moving on now to online, Deputy Mayor Cashmore.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the staff and to the presenters from the neighbourhood areas and the Howick Local Board and for the Howick Local Board themselves. I would think that every local board member and every councillor member has tossed and turned over the loss of some parkland for this purpose of that $230 million to save and help preserve our budgets so we can do other things. I'd also note that we are purchasing $23 million worth of parkland a year as well. So there's a bit of quid pro quo here. The Howick Local Board has been consistent in not supporting any sale of anything. The library sat vacant for 12 years or more from memory, and I did visit 40-foot Lane with Councillor Stewart and the staff and the local board members last year, I believe it was, and I've been back twice since. It is a pretty little park surrounded by nice homes, and it's a great thing. However, there are numerous cases like that right throughout the city, including my ward and yours, where we have had to sacrifice some of these things for the better good. And that's important as well. If we kept every space and didn't do this $230 million worth of asset sales, you're staring at a 10% plus additional rates increase. 10% plus. And I question whether how many people would vote for that. Yes, Auckland is intensifying, and some of this urban new legislation is challenging. But with that comes opportunity to purchase more things and to achieve more. Howick's up for a new big rec centre and potentially a pool. So there are things coming forward that are going to benefit the community. We can't look at these things as one isolated park in an area. This is a region-wide policy that's based upon data and fact, and this particular piece of land does not fit within the recommendations of that data analysis. There is another park space 150 metres away. The commissioners said that they also support revocation, but also asked us to check if we could do something else as far as a local trust. That's been checked out and it's not flowing at all. So, councillors, I know it's a tough choice, and your heart would want to go, oh, let's give this one back. But then I want some back in Franklin, and I'm sure councillors Walker and Watson will want some back in Upper Harbour and Albany, and Shane will want some back in West Auckland. Where does it end? Where does it end? We've got a policy. We all agree to it by vast majority. We need to stick to it. Otherwise, you unravel it one strand at a time and the whole rope breaks. And that is not in the interest of an individual park, an individual suburb, or Auckland as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. Moving on now to Councillor Coombe.
Kia ora, Chair. Tēnā koutou, ngā mihi nui ki a koutou. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to this. I think we're all going to be under pressure in our communities to re-look at sales. I know my area, we've got a couple coming through that the community really wants to be re-evaluated. And I think there's good reasons for doing that with the new MPSUD coming in and the housing reforms, that we do need to look at whether we have got the criteria right across Auckland. So I do support that assessment being ongoing. The reason I wanted to make some comments, because I think I owe it to those who've come along to present, ngā mihi, and to local board members and members of the community who've obviously put a lot of work into presenting and explaining why they would like to keep this lovely bit of green space on their street, a bit of green space that I think people right across Auckland would love to have in their street, in their neighbourhood. So I think I owe it to them to explain why I'm not going to support this notice of motion today. We have a criteria that has been really thought through, Mr. Chair, and we've heard that the intensification doesn't alter the assessment that officers have provided. So we need to apply a fair criteria right across Tamaki Makaurau in the interests of equity and fairness, because as we've heard from the Deputy Mayor, if we start unravelling every single sale, then it is going to have a domino effect, and we won't actually be applying a consistent criteria that provides that equity across Auckland for green space. We've also heard that we should be listening to the community and supporting the community. Well, the community in Howick supported the annual budget. They supported the climate action targeted rate. the community in Howick supported having budget for open space acquisition. So I find it very surprising that Councillor Stewart, who's putting up this notice of motion, opposed, you voted, well, you abstained against the budget, abstained, which isn't a decision, but you voted against the rating, which is the way in which we raise the revenue to pay for open space. You didn't listen to your community in terms of that vote. So I'm sorry to the community members who are now discovering that their councillor didn't support budget for open space acquisition and didn't support budget for climate action. Because we've heard that a lot this morning too, that we need to preserve green space for climate action. So I do feel that we have to take a principled approach, agree the criteria to our asset sales, and in this case, that criteria has been met. Just a final thought in terms of the options. I did put forward, could there be an option of the community getting together and purchasing this vacant section, this green space? Now, because it is for the benefit of a very small neighbourhood. It hasn't been paid for through rates. We've heard that we would have to raise rates by 10% if we don't do asset sales. So the community haven't paid for it already. But if they want to pursue an option that allows that open space to be retained for a community group to get together, they're obviously very well organised, then I would absolutely be willing to support the options. If the community don't want that, fine. I'm not going to be engaging in that process. It's not my community. But I'm absolutely there to support all Aucklanders explore options to shape and develop the communities in the way that they want. And so I'm here to support that community if they would like to pursue any options. I don't know what they might be, but I'm happy to consider that process, a process that might be put on the table. I'm very happy and willing to explore that. So thank you, Mr. Chair, for the opportunity to speak, and just to confirm that for the reasons outlined, I don't support the notice of motion. Kia ora.
Thank you, Councillor. I have Mayor Goff and then Councillor Walker. So, Mayor Goff.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I want to start by saying that parks, open spaces and community facilities are really important in our community. And we've reflected that in our budget, our 10-year budget, because our 10-year budget for those things have gone up from 3.7 billion that we voted in 2018 to 4.56 billion in 2021. That's a $900 million increase. We are increasing parks, reserves and open spaces. We're not reducing them. But what is really important when you have a tight budgetary situation is that you treat people fairly across the board and you have to learn to prioritise, because everybody in this room knows that COVID knocked $900 million out of our budget. And we couldn't simply say, oh, that doesn't really exist. We can't just go out and borrow to pay for the groceries. We borrow to a sensible and prudent level, largely for capital acquisition. That lever couldn't be further expanded. We have an obligation to find savings, and we've found savings. 120 million last year, and 90 million, I think, Peter, this year. But we've squeezed that saving and cost reduction as much as we can. Then it comes to rates. Rates we've set at 3.5% general rates. And of those that are petitioning for a revocation of this sale, 7 out of 8 voted against the budget. That means a rate increase, a general rate increase of 3.5%. Well, I'm sorry, you cannot, as those councillors tend to do, vote against every revenue-raising measure and for every spending measure. That is a recipe for leading to commissioners being appointed, because you can't do your fundamental role as a council, which is balancing your budget and managing your finances prudently. And we had 60 hours of workshop where any of those councillors could have said, here's an alternative way of doing it, but I never heard an alternative way of doing it. The sale of surplus properties is going to raise $244 million. That actually, Chief Financial Officer, I think is the equivalent of a one-off 12% rate increase. You raise about 20 million from a 1% and you're talking about 244. Well, if you don't want to sell the properties, tell me how you're going to raise that 244 million. And one councillor said, well, we're only talking about one property, but here's where the rub comes. You've got to apply your rules fairly right across the community. You set out your criteria for saying these are properties that are lower priority properties, and then you apply that criteria fairly, without fear or favour, right across the board. The moment that you start to say, we'll make an exception for this property because it doesn't meet the criteria, then at that moment you invite every other community across the city to say, well, actually make an exception for us as well. And by the time you've made an exception of everybody, you're left with nothing out of the 244 million. And Deputy Mayor Bill Cashmore is absolutely right. There are all sorts of properties that each one of the people online and around this table could have said, it's in my patch, I'll fight against it. But we can't, because we have to make our budget work. And the sale of lower priority properties is part of that budget. Not to reduce our open public space, but to say we're going to add to it, we're going to create more, but we will apply the same rules for retention or for disposal on all open public space. You cannot have one rule that applies in one area and a totally different rule that applies everywhere else. So for the interests of equity, you set your criteria, you set the rules, you set the standards, and then you fairly apply them right across the region. And that's what our officers have done. They said this land does not meet any one of the 4 criteria that we agreed on as a council for disposal or acquisition of property. And the independent hearing commissioners, let me quote from them. Clause 59, we conclude that in terms of the rationalised parks portfolio, the recreation reserve status of 9R 40-foot lane is a reasonable candidate for revocation. So we got an independent hearing commissioner or group of them in to make a decision, and that was their conclusion. So we're not only following what our officials are saying is the fair application of the rule across the whole community, we're also following what the independent hearing commissioners have advised us. And on that basis, Mr Chairman, while I acknowledge the councillors that have moved this notice of motion, I acknowledge the local board for standing up for their community, and I acknowledge the submitters. If I had a choice between a house next door or a piece of grass, I'd go for the piece of grass every time. But we cannot do that and act fairly for the community as a whole, and for that reason, I cannot support this notice of motion.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Moving on to Councillor Walker.
The outstanding question that I'd pose to councillors and the Mayor and anyone that happens to be listening as an Aucklander is, where will the children play? Where will the children play? It's a classic Cat Stevens refrain, and it's certainly applicable right now. I am fairly disturbed by some of the information that I see put up around the table. One of the things that councillors should know is that when you sell a reserve, the Reserve Act requires that land and the proceeds of it to be sold to pay for reserves. It can't be spent on anything else. It can't be spent to address operational issues in the rates. And there seems to be some confusion around that. Reserves are capital, and they can only be spent by way of sale on other capital in the form of other reserves. So let's make that very, very clear, because that information has not been adequately provided to us, and I will stand by it. It is also very clear, and I certainly established it by way of question, that the impact of sea level rise has not been considered. The loss of the Esplanade reserves, which are significant in the proximity of this area, is going to happen and is inevitable, and is already acknowledged elsewhere where this process is underway. It hasn't happened here. The officers have not considered it. There has been no reporting on that. Zero. Yet there are councillors around this table that pretend to be concerned around climate change. Pretend, I say, because when it comes to a decision, as I point out on any number of occasions, on a decision-by-decision basis, those councillors are found wanting. They are not, and I will state it again, not doing the right thing by future generations, especially children. And I address the question again, where will the children play? We're coming out of COVID. We had some marvellous presenters, including a woman who I hold in some esteem on the basis of what she said from her teaching experience about the impact of COVID, the impact on anxiety, the number of children that are presently homeschooled or not even going to school because of a variety of reasons. What do those children need? What is most critical to them? As she said, open spaces in their community that are accessible, safe, places where they can play, which is an innate human experience that everyone needs, children, but also older people. And where are those places? And this is one such place. I also established, by way of questions, that if we do have to replace this reserve, and I would suggest we will in this vicinity, because as Councillor Watson has pointed out and Councillor Stewart has pointed out and the people in the community have pointed out, there is going to be huge growth in this area, and all of the councillors know that it's immensely market attractive. If we had some detailed reporting on that and some forecasting and some future evaluation, they would tell us that. So we are going to have significantly more density here, and we all know, because we are familiar with the medium density legislation, which we opposed, that there is almost no land now on an individual property for a child to play. It's almost zero. And where the density goes up and that provision for space is on the part of a tiny little deck, that is the future that we face in this area and so many areas, and that is the reality that the councillors know comes into play on the 20th of August next month. This is not just some flippant thing for councillors to consider. This is a reality that faces our community. And what is our responsibility? Our responsibility as custodians, as city fathers, excuse the sexism, but that has been a long-standing expression, is to take into account the needs of future generations. As countless city fathers that have stood and sat in this building, men and women have done before us. And we are not carrying out that role significantly, substantially, and adequately. So in a circumstance where a community comes to us overwhelmingly, as this community has done, both local and more spread, and pointed out the need for this reserve, this park, that is used and loved, and it is supported by the ward councillors, Stewart and Young, and it is supported overwhelmingly by the local board. What should we do? I suggest that our role is to question officers, to actually ask questions. And I say all of that to you. Ask questions. Would you be making this decision if it was in your ward and your local board and your community was overwhelmingly giving you this information? And I would suggest that the answer that you know in your heart of hearts is that answer would be no. You would be supporting that community. This is not my community, but I'm an Aucklander and an Auckland councillor, and I support them wholeheartedly. And if this is voted down, it is an ongoing failure and another reflection of the crisis in confidence that I suggest exists in Auckland around this council and significantly parts of its leadership. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Walker. I have no other requests for speak. I'll just give that a second. Cool, okay. To wrap up the debate, we have the mover, Councillor Stewart.
Well, thank you. I think just about everything's been said, and I think Councillor Walker has really hit it all on the head. And one of the things that I think we really do need to know, sales of reserves, the money from the sale of that reserve, does that really do have to go back into reserve?
Reserves Act 1977.
Okay. So it's a shame we haven't had all that information given to us. But anyway, this really was the last chance for me to try and put this before the council to try and save 40 foot. And that's why I very lucky I got eight signatures to have this notice of motion. And I really thought that you would all really support this. I'm really shocked at what I'm hearing here. I'm really disappointed. When I was part of Manukau Council, we actually came to this Auckland Super City with a lot of money. Auckland Council and Manukau, we came with Auckland Airport shares. We were very careful with our spending with Manukau. We came with a lot of money. Howick hasn't really spent very much money in the time that we've been amalgamated, and this is only just a very small ask. This is a very much loved reserve. It's not even worth a lot of money, but it's worth a lot to the people that live in that community. And we've had the local board here. We've had local submissions here. We've had the local community here. Everybody's stating their case, and Councillor Walker's quite right. It's all about where will the children play, and climate change does come into all of this. You know, I'm really disappointed in hearing some of the councillors talk around this table today about, you know, money. To be honest, it's not, you know, the money that we're going to receive for this is really a pittance, but we can't replace that reserve. So anyway, I just hope that you're all going to really, all of you that are not around here at the moment, if you're online, I really do hope that you really do listen, and you have listened to the community, because really we need your support. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. The debate is concluded. I acknowledge the passion with the debate and that we can share these ideas as a council. Okay, we've got the resolution on screen. To save you the trouble, I'll call a division myself. So, division.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A division has been called on the motion which is on the screen. Can members say yes or no when your name is called? Mayor Goff.
No.
Deputy Mayor Cashmore.
No.
Councillor Bartley.
No.
Councillor Casey.
No.
Councillor Collins.
Against.
Councillor Coombe.
Against.
Councillor Cooper.
Against.
Councillor Dalton.
Against.
Councillor Darby.
Against.
Councillor Filipina.
Kaore. Against.
Councillor Fletcher.
For.
Councillor Hills.
Against.
Councillor Mulholland.
For.
Councillor Newman.
For.
Councillor Sayers.
For.
Councillor Stewart. IMSB Chair Taipari.
Against.
Councillor Walker. Councillor Watson. Councillor Young.
For.
Councillor Henderson.
Against.
Thank you.
Thank you, councillors. The motion has been lost, 8 to 13.